is so well. Good morning. This is Pushing Boundaries, a podcast about pioneering research, breakthrough discoveries, and unconventional ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas R. Verney. My guest today is Professor Dave Pruett, former NASA researcher, award-winning computational scientist, emeritus professor of applied mathematics at James Madison University. He's the originator of From Black Elk to Black Holes, a Templeton-award-winning Honors seminar at JMU. And he's the author of Reason and Wonder, a Copernican Revolution in Science and Spirit, which was published in 2012 and again in paperback in 2016. Reason and Wonder synthesizes modern scientific insights with ancient spiritual wisdom. Welcome, Professor Dave Pruett.
Well,
may I call you Dave?
Certainly, and I hope I can call you Thomas.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So my question to you is, first of all, is the universe purposeful?
Well, first of all, Thomas, I'm really honored to be here. As you mentioned, I'm an applied mathematician, so I have a foot in mathematics and one in science. So as a scientist, my sense is that most rank and file scientists are agnostic on the question, is the universe purposeful? That is, it's a question that's really outside of the domain of science. My sense is also that most biologists are atheistic on the question. The late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould stated that evolution was purposeless, non-progressive, and materialistic. I would differ with that. I actually think you can make a pretty strong case for purposefulness in the universe, and no one that I know of made a better case for that than Teilhard de Chardin, who weave together science and spirituality beautifully. So should I continue?
Yes, oh please, it's wonderful. Yes, I'm totally fascinated. Yes, okay. Please continue.
Well, if your listeners are unfamiliar with Teilhard, and many people are, he was a French paleontologist of the first rank, but also a Jesuit priest. He lived from 1881 to 1955. He was so devout in his faith that he wished to die on an Easter Sunday, and that prayer or wish was answered by a massive heart attack on April 10th, 1955, which was Easter. But as a paleontologist, Teilhard fully embraced evolutionary theory. He carried a magnifying glass and a geology hammer on every outing. But he saw the theory as perhaps too narrow. Not only does biological life evolve, but the entire cosmos is evolving. And during his lifetime, for example, we went from believing that the Milky Way was the only galaxy to the recognition that it is one among 100 billion or more galaxies, and that the universe itself is expanding. And we have learned that the fusion processes of stars create elements necessary for life, and that exploding supernovas spew those elements and even heavier ones across space to provide the raw materials for new planets and new solar systems and new life. So Teilhard coined the term cosmogenesis to indicate a universe in continual creation. So we might ask, when was the moment of creation? And we could answer that in many ways. We could say it was 13.7 billion years ago at the advent of the Big Bang. But we could also say it was yesterday. And we could say it's today or even right now. And if creation is ongoing, then there's a corollary that in some small way, you and I are partners in this creative process. We're helping this universe to evolve. Teilhard believed that evolution wasn't just a theory, but it was a guiding principle of the cosmos. He said it's a light illuminating all facts, to use his words. Now, I think at this point in history, most of us are ready to accept the notion of cosmogenesis, that the universe is evolving, that everything changes. But the question is, a deeper question is it going anywhere? Is there a direction to that evolution? And again, most evolutionary biologists would probably say no. Evolution is a random walk that could wander off in one direction or any other direction. But Teilhard disagreed with this. On Earth, at least, and that's the only real evidence we have, life has slowly evolved from billions of years of one-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms to very functionally complex organisms, and ultimately to very complex organisms with large brains, like ourselves. Is this just an accident, we might ask? Well, the basic ingredients of evolution are variation and natural selection. Well, variation is very much a random process. It's based on random mutations, quantum fluctuations within reproductive cells. But natural selection is not really a random process, or not fully random, because it selects for those variations that give the organism an adaptive advantage, and higher intelligence is advantageous. So for this evolutionary process that gives rise to greater biological complexity, but along with it, higher self-awareness, Teilhard coined the term complexity consciousness, or simply, in a word, complexification. So he's kind of given us two large megatrends that apply to the cosmos as a whole. One of those is cosmogenesis, which is sort of the physical cosmos in evolution, but the other is complexification, which is the biological cosmos also in evolution. And he realized that these megatrends run counter to one another. That is, from a thermodynamic point of view, and this gets complicated, the cosmos is running downhill. It's headed toward heat death. But life, oddly enough, bucks that trend. It's headed for greater complexity, organization, and higher consciousness. So this begs another question. Are these counter trends somehow connected? Well, Teilhard intuited that the answer to that was yes, but he was really peering over the horizon. He was extrapolating from the science he had available to him at the time. So he was not able to make that connection firm. And I suspect we don't have time to go into great detail today, but recent scientific developments, particularly in the field of complexity theory, have added more insights. And I think one can now conclude, or at least the science suggests, that the very running down of the physical cosmos, that trend toward heat death, actually is what propels the biological world upward. So these two megatrends are greatly coupled. And if that's the case, it's not too much of a stretch, even scientifically, to suggest that the universe is indeed purposeful, and that its purpose seems to be the production of higher consciousness.
Very interesting. So what does higher consciousness mean? What is the meaning? Like, what is higher consciousness as opposed to lower consciousness?
Well, you're a psychiatrist, and you might split hairs on this more than I do, but Teilhard more or less used the terms psyche, spirit, and consciousness as interchangeable. And he believed that there is a sort of proto-consciousness all the way down to the most basic structural ingredients in the universe, even the elementary particles. That is consciousness all the way down. Now, I know in psychological circles, sometimes sentience is used as just the basic awareness of the organism of its environment. And the term consciousness would be used for self-awareness or awareness of one's own consciousness. But to Teilhard, this was all a great spectrum, from proto-consciousness all the way down to self-awareness in the human organism.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I would agree with that there is consciousness all the way down to unicellular organisms. I don't have a problem with that. What I'm interested in, you wrote a paper, Finding the Axis Mundi, in an undergraduate classroom. That was published recently, in August 2022.
It just came out online actually this month.
There we go. So fresh off the presses, right?
Right.
And, okay. And in it you say, yeah, I'll just read from the abstract. It says, humanity is in a tight race between planetary catastrophe and enlightenment. It's not clear which will prevail. So if we just take those two sentences, if we are moving more and more towards complexity, right? How is it that we are also coming closer and closer to planetary catastrophe? How do those two sort of movements equate? How do we bring those two together? It seems to me it doesn't make sense to say that we are becoming more conscious, which would mean that we can take better care of ourselves and the planet, and at the same time, we are becoming so good at destroying it.
Well, the question you're asking is far above my pay grade. It's almost the question, why is there evil in the world?
Yes, that's also a good question. Yes.
But and let me go back to Teilhard, because he's my touchstone.
Okay.
As a priest, he could have opted out of service during the First World War. He opted in, but as a non-combatant, as a stretcher bearer. And although he was Catholic, he served a regiment of Muslim sharpshooters. Mm. He spent the entire 4 or 5 years in the war, in some of the most horrific battles, and he saw just tremendous devastation and brutality and horror. Somehow he did not seem to be psychologically fazed by that. And he wrote many of his seminal essays on the battlefield. By the way, he was he was honored for bravery time and time again and offered promotions, which he refused to stay in service to his regiment.
Mm-hmm.
But he had this huge bird's eye view, God's eye view, I should say, of evolution, that it's not a linear process. There are fits and starts. Okay. And he recognized that humanity is a very young species, and we are still struggling to figure out who we are and where we're going and how to live. And I don't personally have this God's eye view. I mean, I think it takes a much higher degree of consciousness than I have. But Teilhard is my touchstone in many ways. But
well,
he
go ahead.
He thought that we would eventually find our way, and if we don't, something better will succeed us.
Well, speaking of something better, in the same paper, you say, new paradigm is emerging, one that emphasizes interconnectedness, the sacredness of all creation, universal consciousness, and cooperation. In truth, this new paradigm is anything but new. What's new is that scientific discoveries are now beginning to resonate with and reinforce ancient wisdom that has been embedded in indigenous mythologies for millennia. I'm wondering whether you could talk about that a little bit, about the ancient wisdom and indigenous mythologies.
Sure, I'll try, Thomas.
Sure.
When I was growing up, there were rumors that there was Cherokee in my family history. And when I was a child, my mom read to me from the book Hiawatha. It turns out that after a DNA test, there's almost no Native American blood in our family, 1% or less. But for reasons I don't understand fully, I've always had a fascination and respect for Native America and the mythology. But among the Lakota people, there's a passphrase that goes like this: Mitakuye Oyasin, Mitakuye Oyasin. And it literally translates all my relatives. But the meaning is much deeper than that. The meaning, in my understanding, is that all things in creation are my relatives. So most Native Americans that I've encountered and that I've read about recognize that there is spirit all the way down, that spirit exists not only in humans, but in animals, in plants, even in rocks. And even in the four cardinal directions that are referred to as thought of as benevolent beings and referred to by the Lakota by the phrase Tunkashila, which means grandfather. Now, this has sometimes been referred to in a pejorative way as animism. But it's my understanding that even though this point of view was probably loathed to most scientists, that science is slowly coming around to this view of the world. And quantum mechanics is largely responsible for that. I mean, science has been built on the subject-object divide that goes back to Descartes. There's the thinking world, the race cogitans and the external world, the res extensa, and these two things are separate. And so the scientific observer can observe the world without affecting it in any way. He or she is completely isolated from the object of observation. But the uncertainty principle and other aspects of quantum mechanics tell us that there is no real separation between subject and object at the quantum level, and that the observer affects the thing being observed, and that the experiment cannot really be completely set up without the observer in the loop. And if that's the case, then there's no separation, but then the separation between mind and matter is artificial. And some renowned physicist, for example, I think it was James Jeans, if my memory is correct, who said the universe is beginning to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. And other Roger Penrose and other eminent physicists have posed that psyche must be incorporated into the laws of physics if physics is to be complete in some way.
Very true. Yes, yes, I agree. So on a more more personal level, how did you move from mathematics into consciousness? What was your personal journey like? Tell me a little.
So it's a long story, but I'll give you the outlines of it. I'm what you call a late bloomer, which might not seem to be relevant. But I had great difficulty with what Jung would call individuation. I was slow to mature and to find my place in the world because of feeling torn between two aspects of my own personality. My rational nature on the one hand, my love for science, and on the other hand, my intuitive nature and inherent spirituality. And this goes back to my family of origin, and I don't know if we'll talk about that.
Well, yes. What about your family of origin? Yes, let's talk about it.
Well, I grew up in West Virginia on the edge of Appalachia, but not quite in Appalachia. My father was a small town physician. He fought in the Second World War. At the end of the war, he helped liberate the concentration camp at Dachau. Dad was very rational. He was not overtly religious, but he had one of the truest moral compasses of any human being I've ever met. He had a great deal of integrity. Mom, on the other hand, was a homemaker. That was par for the course in those days. She was quite religious. She went to the same Baptist church her entire life. And she was also quite intuitive. And like many families, there was a fair amount of dysfunction in mine. And I got caught between those parental poles, the rational on the one hand and the intuitive on the other. And psychologically, I felt I had to choose one or the other, that I somehow couldn't be both. What actually happened is I wound up flip-flopping back and forth between the poles. And so I didn't really settle until midlife. I got my PhD at 38, married at 39, and became a father at 47. So I'm really a late bloomer. And I really struggled to integrate the rational intuitive pole in my life. And sort of the best I could do with that on my own was teaching mathematics, because particularly applied mathematics, because that satisfied both my scientific nature, but I also find mathematics is almost magical, and its teaching is very service oriented. So it was satisfying spiritually as well. But I had great fortune at midlife to stumble on a mentor, or maybe stumble is the wrong word. In retrospect, it seems quite synchronous. And his name was John Youngblood. And he helped me to realize that what I thought was a personal struggle to integrate these parts of my personality was actually had a name. And he called it the struggle of the mystic. And the struggle, the mystical, the quintessential mystical struggle is to try to bring together two parts of the personality that threaten to tear one apart. And John himself had gone through this struggle, but he was also a student of Jung and a student of Teilhard. So he introduced me to both of those. And in Teilhard in particular, thought that he had to choose between his scientific nature, which also came from his father, and his spiritual nature, which came from his mother. And fortunately, he also, there was a wise priest that he went to see who said, no, don't choose, be faithful to both of them. And it was Mary Louise von Franz, the protege of Jung, who said, if we can live with this tension of opposites long enough, we can give birth to something that's wholly new, that transcends the opposites. And Teilhard did that. And John, my mentor, also was able to do that. Jung did that. And so I began to realize that what I thought was an interior, just my own personal struggle, was actually societal. And particularly in the US, there's great contention between science and religion, science and spirituality. And so I began to, at the time I started thinking about this, I was actually working, my first academic job had not worked out well. So I was at NASA Langley Research Center doing aerospace research. But I began to fantasize about going back into the classroom and offering an honors course. And oddly enough, the title came to me in whole cloth. And that happens to me frequently. And everything proceeded from that. And the title was From Black Elk to Black Holes, Shaping a Myth for a New Millennium, because we were on the cusp of the new millennium. And I wasn't even in the classroom at that time. So in 1996, I got an offer from James Madison University. I had a short tenure clock because of a previous experience, so I was tenured in a couple of years. And after I got tenured, I went to the honors program and said, here's a course I would like to teach. And I expected to be laughed off the stage. The honors director at that time was Joanne Gavin, who is a force of nature. And she's the founder of The Furious Flower, which is an organization that promotes Black poetry. And she didn't laugh me off the stage. She was actually quite supportive. My department was quite supportive, and my colleagues were supportive, which I never expected. And I think part of that's because of the kind of institution James Madison University is. Our bread and butter is really undergraduate teaching. And so there's a lot of collegiality and a reasonable lack of ego. Just to give you an example, a physics colleague, a dear friend, who would probably characterize himself as an atheist or agnostic, said, "Dave, it's not for me, but I want you to be aware of the Templeton Foundation Science and Religion course, and I think you ought to apply for it." So basically, this dream course that I had came to fruition in the spring of 1999. And as I looked out over the 21 eager and very shining, intelligent faces, I was overcome by emotion, joy at the opportunity, and abject terror because I had no idea what I was doing at that point. It was really a leap of faith into uncharted waters. And so I had to listen to my better angels, and my better angels said, "Dave, just be honest with the students." So on the very first day of class, I said to them, "I think I have a book in me, and I think that teaching this course will help me to write it." And that actually turned out to be a true statement, but it was really naive because it was 13 years from that point until my book, Reason and Wonder, appeared in print. But a funny thing happened during that confession. The students realized that this was not your ordinary course, that we were on a journey together, and the destination was not predetermined. And so I got immediate buy-in from day one. And to make a long story short, that course succeeded beyond my wildest hopes and dreams. It touched many students' lives. It touched my life. I taught the course 7 times total. I did receive a Science Religion Course Award in 2001. I received the Provost's first award for excellence in honors teaching a few years later. And the premise of the course was to look at the cosmos from diametrically opposed points of view. From a scientific point of view on one hand, and a mythological point of view on the other hand. So even though the course got an award as a science and religion course, it was intentionally a science and mythology course. And that was to avoid some of the pitfalls of talking about religion. Religion is based often on dogma and on creed and on absolute truth. Mythology is based on metaphor, and no one takes metaphor literally. Okay, but mythology also gives us access to great spiritual truths. So the mythology in the course was focused on Native American mythology, and it came from the great American classic Black Elk Speaks. And that hence the title of the course, From Black Elk to Black Hole. So from Native American mythology to modern science. And the idea is, can we possibly find any points of nexus, any commonalities between these vastly different worldviews?
Fantastic, wonderful. So you said that you have taught this course for 7 years, 7 consecutive years?
No, I taught it 7 times between 1999 and 2017.
Oh,
the last time I taught it, I was actually in retirement, but the honors program allowed me to teach it one more time.
so have you stayed, excuse me, have you stayed in touch with any of the students?
I've stayed in touch with quite a few, more percentage-wise than would be normal. One Rusty, who lives in Charlottesville now, goes back to the first course in 1999. Jessa lives in Zurich, Switzerland, and invited me to a science and religion conference about 3 years ago. I just got an email this week from a student who took the course in 2017. I'm not going to use her name. She wrote because of a family trauma. She had just lost a sister. And she doesn't consider herself a religious person. So she was writing for some kind of reassurance that something about our spirit, our soul, survives bodily death. And she ended her email with probably the best compliment I've ever gotten in my life. She said, "The course was and is my church." So it spoke to her deeply. And the first time I taught the course, a student wrote on the course evaluation. She wrote, "Is it appropriate to write on a course evaluation that this course touched or changed my life?" It did. So it's not uncommon for me to get an email out of the blue 5 or 6 years later from a student expressing their gratitude for the course. And one of the key components was a journal. The students kept journals, and the journal was for them to process various aspects of the course. And some of the ideas that came up could challenge their conventional notions, or there could be competing ideas coming up in class, or they might challenge some sacred cow. But a characteristic of honor students is the ability to live with ambiguity, more so than the average student. And so I kept telling the students that these journals were for them, not for me. And it took a long time to convince them of that fact. But eventually you could see a sea change in what they wrote. And I think many of them look back on those journals, and then it helps them retrieve aspects of the course that meant something to them. And when I read the journals for the first time, I was just astounded. I came in, I had read them for the first time during spring break, and I came in after spring break and said, this was a sacred experience. And it was. It gave me a window into the soul of students that I had never been opened before. And it was not something to be taken lightly.
So may I ask, how has it affected you, your life, your outlook, your personality?
Well, I grew up in a world that was originally pretty small. As I said, I grew up on the edge of Appalachia. I didn't travel very much until midlife. And I usually stayed pretty close to home. I went to graduate school for a master's degree at the University of Virginia. I went to Virginia Tech as an undergrad. But I'll just confess to you that at age 34, I had a major depression. And looking back, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I I was just trying to live inside a skin that was too small. My worldview was much too small. And on the flip side of that, I wound up going to the University of Arizona for graduate school, which is a big leap for me. So my world began to open up there. But that opening process has continued. And I think teaching the course not only helped me to open up the worldviews of the students, but it opened up my own worldview. And I just became exposed to things that I'd never thought about before, or if I had, my scientific nature would have just sloughed them off as not rational in some way. Out of the clear blue, after getting the Templeton Science and Religion Course Award, I got a book from someone I didn't know called The Intuitive Heart. It was written by Dr. Henry Reed, who is a maverick psychologist. And Henry had gotten my name from the awardees of the Templeton Award. And he sent his book to every one of them, apparently, and I'm the only one who responded. I read it, and I thought that this book is written on two very different levels. And on the surface level, it's all about intuition. But on the surface level, it's written for everybody. But it was sitting on this tremendous iceberg of depth. And so I contacted Henry about that. And he says, "Yep, Dave, you're right." And he invited me to this workshop on dreaming in Sedona, Arizona. This is, I think, 2002. Well, to make a long story short, Henry, who's now a dear friend and not in very good health, he pioneered an experience called the Dream Helper Ceremony, which is an experience in intentional dreaming for altruistic purposes. And he pioneered this with Robert Vandecastle, who was in the psychology department at the University of Virginia. And Henry has offered this experience hundreds of times, and I participated in it 6 different times. But in many ways, it is to me the closest thing we have to the closest validation we have to the idea of some form of universal consciousness, or as Jung would say, a collective unconscious, perhaps. So very briefly, this experience happens in groups of 8 or 10, and one person volunteers to be the focus person who is dealing with some life issue. They don't reveal what the life issue is, and the other participants promise to have a dream for that person that will help them in some way. And it sounds very woo-woo. Two interesting things happen that cannot be refuted. Whatever you think of the experience, these cannot be refuted. When one makes that promise, the incidence of remembered dreams goes up from about 25%, which is normal, to 95% or better. And the second thing, which Henry realized during a presentation at a conference at the University of Virginia, is that in all the times he had led this experience, no one had ever asked the obvious question: how do you dream for another person? No one had ever asked that. And everybody who participates in the experience is really scared. Reason you would think. Everybody is scared because they wonder, what happens if I don't have a dream? What if I let down the other person? And what you find when you participate in this is that the mosaic of dreams, more often than not, speak directly to the issue of the focus person. Now, I would not have had the openness to participate in this, I don't think, if I had not taught this course and written this book, and which both helped open me up. Mm-hmm. And actually, I brought Henry to the honors course on 3 different occasions to lead this experience. It was for the students, for a few colleagues, not many colleagues accepted, and also for the community. And several students said that this was the most meaningful group experience of their entire lives. And we, of course, this being very out of the ordinary, we kept evaluations to make sure that it was, that this process was well received, and it was.
And you say that this gentleman now is in ill health?
Yes, he's a few years older than I am, and he's now struggling with some cognitive issues. But my wife once asked me who's the smartest person I ever met. And I don't know why she asked that, because that's not like her to ask a question like that. But after thinking and thinking, I said, Henry Reed, he's brilliant. And even if he's experiencing some declining cognition, he has a tremendous amount to offer. He was actually recently interviewed a year or 2 ago by Jeffrey Mishlove.
Oh, yes. Yes, I know him.
I think you interviewed him recently.
Yes, I did.
So that's just one of the example of how I've been opened up.
Well, since we are talking about your openness, I also understand that you are a poet.
Fair to middling one.
Okay.
I haven't. From time to time, the muse will strike, and during the pandemic, I needed a project, and so I published a little book, basically a collection of old poems. And I didn't have enough of those, so I made it a photographic essay and included some photographs. It's called Earth Tones.
Would you mind reading one of your poems for us?
Well, there's one that's really relevant to today, and it was written in 2020. It's the only poem that was written recently. And the title is What a World Needs. What a World Needs. And I'm going to get a sip of tea here.
Oh, yes, by all means. Yes.
What a world needs. Gravity is cool, the disarming title of a whip-smart paper by iconoclast physicist Freeman Dyson. I met him once, the paper his parting gift. Gravity's cool, spooky action at a distance, mystifying even to Einstein. Tethers planets to their stars, each Keplerian orbit, one beat of a celestial clock, ticking out the eons of deep time, while evolution slow cooks its magical stew on spaceship Earth, and most probably on every other Goldilocks wanderer and 100 billion galaxies. But gravity runs hot too, when it crushes dying stars, igniting supernova that vaporize suns 10 times greater than our own, spewing carbon, oxygen, iron, even uranium, across light years of quantum foam. The stardust of which I am knit together, and you too are wrought, and the oak, and the shark, and the otter. What then does a world need? Chaos, by God, and order, devastation, and rejuvenation, fleeting creativity, and fathomless drudgery, a pinch of the former, and a neutron star tablespoon of the latter, both the legacy of gravity's cosmic dance, the core sacrificial act of a universe's ceaseless labor to flower beings sufficiently awake to enjoy the show, though not yet awake enough to thank our lucky stars or to treasure this shining orb called home.
Great.
Thank you.
Just great. Just absolutely great. Well, David, it has been a real pleasure speaking with you. For our listeners, may I just remind them of Dave Pruett's fantastic book, Reason and Wonder, A Copernican Revolution in Science and Spirit. And if you want to learn more about ancient spiritual wisdom and modern scientific insights, read this book and learn and change for the better, because our world certainly needs that. May I say, David, once again, thank you so much for participating with me in this conversation. And I wish you best of luck in all your future endeavors. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure, truly.
Promise, I'm so honored, and I really appreciate you working with me to alleviate my my stage fright. Yeah.
You were just fine. Thank you very much again, and hope we can meet again in the future. Take care.
All the best
Bye-bye.
to you too.
The
Bye.
best to you.